we are thrilled to present this webinar from Mind Medicine Australia featuring Alexander as he's known, Beiner from London. And he will be talking about, can psychedelics change society? What an interesting subject matter that is. And just a reminder to all of you that our focus is on the development and use of evidence-based psychedelic-assisted therapies within the regulated healthcare system. We don't encourage the use of psychedelic medicines outside of this context. And our presentations are for educational purposes. We don't consider them medical advice. This session is being recorded, as you know, and it will be presented on our YouTube channel. And we just like to acknowledge the owners of the lands on which we all come from, their elders, past, present, emerging. And we particularly acknowledge the light keepers, the wisdom keepers, the medicine keepers who've brought these medicines and therapies from ancient times to today. We stand on their shoulders, and we wouldn't be here without them as we carry these incredible treatments into the most challenging of times in human history, or certainly one of the most challenging times in human history. And we just wanted to say a big hello to all of you. And if you want to put in the chat where you're from, and if you're new to Mind Medicine Australia, we might just stop the share for a moment so that we can see you all, and you can give a big wave to Ali over in London, and I'm sure some of you also from London and the US and other places, and just tell us where you're from in the chat and say hi. And it should be very interesting conversations, a little different to some of our usual webinars. And we're very much looking forward to your thoughts and questions. There'll be an opportunity for your questions to be answered by Ali or our team at the end of Ali's short presentation. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to ask those questions. The chat will be switched off during the actual presentation by Ali. And look, so we've got people from all over the place. Welcome. Can we also have a show of hands to who hasn't attended a Mind Medicine Australia webinar before? Just put up your hand physically if you haven't been here before. Well, welcome. Welcome to Mind Medicine Australia, and welcome to this webinar. And I'm now going to give you a little short introduction to Mind Medicine Australia so you understand who we are and why we exist. So I'll go to the next slide now. And this is why we exist, because we have a mental health pandemic in Australia, which is significant and getting worse daily. So 1 in 5 Australian adults at last count had a chronic mental illness. Those figures are at the moment expected to be at least at 1 in 4, if not 1 in 3. 1 in 7 Australians are now on antidepressants, including 1 in 30 children and 1 in 4 older people over the age of 55. I think many of us know the dependency that is caused by psychiatric medications, side effects that can be caused, and the difficulty of withdrawing from those medicines. Also recently, some statistics came out which are showing that 1 in 3 young people have experienced a mental disorder in the past 12 months. That's a huge increase. And of course, there's massive cost to the system, and there's an enormous amount of suffering. And clinicians simply don't have the tools to get people well and out of the system. The elephant in the room is the fact that there is not current treatments that are working for the majority of patients. And you can see that elephant trying to get the attention of the bureaucrats and trying to say, hey, we need to do something about all this suffering in the community. We need to provide tools for people to get better. So we can see that there's been minimal innovation in the last 50 years in the area of mental health care, with, in the case of depression, only a maximum of 35% of people go into remission. And as I mentioned before, the side effects are significant. In the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, remission rates are as low as 5 to 10%. And drug addiction relapse rates are as high as 80%. Eating disorders are very hard to treat. We have many wonderful clinicians in Australia and around the world, many of whom are probably on this call, and we thank you for your incredible passion and dedication to your work. But we recognise the fact that you don't have enough tools in your toolbox to treat your suffering patients, and we empathise with that, and we're here to help. Our goal as a mental health charity is to alleviate the suffering caused through mental illness with a whole-of-system approach. Our primary focus is on bringing psychedelic therapies, particularly psilocybin and MDMA, into the health system in a controlled way and to be used only in clinical environments. For us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of the mental health system, that they achieve high remission rates, as they've been doing in the recent trials. And in recent trials, we've been seeing remission rates of 60 to 80% after just 2 to 3 medicinal sessions in combination with a short course of psychotherapy. And there's been a number of recent trials that have reported, including the MAPS Phase 3 Part 2 trials from USONA, and also trials from Compass Pathways, which all support these sorts of remission rates. So just think how many of us, our friends, our families, our workers, our colleagues could be getting better if they had access to these treatments. And that's our goal at Mind Medicine Australia, to make sure that these treatments can be accessible and affordable to all Australians in need, regardless of their financial circumstances or their geographic location. As I mentioned, our focus is psilocybin and MDMA. 2 to 3 dose sessions, in contrast to potentially a lifetime sentence of mental illness, where patients are taking these medicines potentially for the rest of their lives, having weekly or more psychotherapy sessions, and continuing to suffer and often getting worse due to the effects of the psychiatric medications. These medicines are truly curative. They're not just palliative. They're not just managing a condition. The safety results in the clinical trials and in clinical use pre-prohibition have been outstanding. There's no evidence of addiction. Both medicines have been granted breakthrough therapy designation, which is a designation that is only granted by the FDA in the US to fast-track the approval process for medicines that are considered vastly superior to existing treatments. We're also looking at ketamine-assisted therapy, and we talk about that in some of our other webinars as well. So Mind Medicine Australia's goal is to build the ecosystem to ensure that these treatments can become available to those who need them. We do that through 4 strategic pillars: awareness and knowledge building. So we deal with all sorts of stakeholder groups, from clinicians to patients to regulators and lawyers, the general public, and anyone who's interested. So if you're out there on this webinar and you would like a webinar or talk to your team or your colleagues about these treatments, we have a wonderful group of clinicians and a wonderful team who can come and present to you and present either live in person or webinars for you. We have an extraordinary advisory panel and lived experience panel, and many of them are available to speak at webinars and events for you as well. We also, of course, present many events, and this is part of our global webinar series, and we have some wonderful webinars coming up, and I'll show you a couple of those in a moment. We also present to the media. We have regular chapter events, and we're shortly bringing Dr. Ben Sessa to Australia. In fact, he's arriving in Australia on the weekend, and we've got some wonderful events with Dr. Ben, which we'll talk about in a moment. Our focus is always on trial results, on the science and clinical expertise. We also have an incredible professional development program, a part-time professional certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies called our CPAT course. It is for health professionals of all disciplines. I'll show you a slide in that in a moment, with a world-leading faculty. We also offer mentoring for CPAT graduates, short courses, workshops, and more. We also have a large research program. We help secure $15 million of research from the former federal government for research trials. We helped set up the first neuromedicines centre at Monash University. And we are providing direct research funding for a range of trials around Australia and have set up a psychedelic registry in partnership with the Australian National University to document data of clinical treatments that start to take place. Because as you all know, or many of you will know, we as Mind Medicine Australia applied to the TGA for rescheduling of psilocybin and MDMA over the past few years. And on February the 3rd, the TGA announced the rescheduling of these medicines from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8. So they're controlled medicines now. They can only be used under clinical supervision and the guidance of psychiatrists and other trained professionals. But what that means is that shortly psychiatrists will be treating patients in this country, and we will be, not we, but the university will be collecting data on that. As I said earlier, our focus is also on accessibility and equity. And we also have a major partnership with Optimi in Canada to provide psilocybin and MDMA, and they'll be providing psilocybin and MDMA for clinical trials and research. We also have a patient support fund and a donation fund. And we encourage those of you who are on this call to donate to us in whatever capacity you can. We simply can't do this alone. My husband and I are philanthropists, but we've relied on the support of many philanthropists, large and small. And for just 2 cups of coffee a week, you can make a difference. And you can help ensure that these treatments get to those who need them most, because there is no way in the world that these treatments should only be for people who are wealthy and can afford them. These treatments are for everybody. And in Indigenous cultures, they've been used by everybody in those communities since the beginning of human civilization. So this is our world first rescheduling, some of the headlines that occurred around the world. And we congratulate the TGA on their foresight and vision in rescheduling these medicines. In their rescheduling decision, they mentioned that one of the key reasons for rescheduling was due to the levels of suffering in the community and the fact that most of the current treatments were not working for the majority of patients. And those rescheduling submissions that we made were supported by over 13,000 Australians, including thousands of clinicians and researchers, and 98% of those submissions were in favour of rescheduling. What does the rescheduling mean? It means psychiatrists who have trained in psychedelic assisted therapies can apply to become an authorised prescriber using MDMA to treat PTSD or psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And these are the ways and the steps that a psychiatrist must follow. And a number of psychiatrists in Australia have received human research ethics committee and are just awaiting on the TGA to approve them as an authorised prescriber. Just let me see if there's anything else there that I want to share with you. We can, of course, answer questions on all of this in the Q&A after Ali's session. So we hope to see authorised prescribers beginning to deliver treatments before the end of this year. So this is a great opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, because we are helping to fund this interventional registry at the Australian National University. And if you're a doctor working with psychedelics, including ketamine, then please register. If you're a patient undergoing psychedelic treatment, then speak to your doctor to make sure that the data for your treatments are collected, because then this will add to the body of evidence, real-world evidence that is essential so that people can understand and learn more about these treatments. So I mentioned some upcoming events. We have a breathwork and meditation event in Melbourne. We have Dr. Ben Sessa presenting a range of lectures, public lectures in Australia, and also workshops for clinicians. So you can see those there in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney. On the 22nd of November, we have Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, of course, one of the leading clinicians in the world on the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and Dr. Geeta Vade, who's a psychiatrist in New York and the international director of our CPAT course. That should be an extraordinary one. And then, of course, we have Dr. Gabor Mate on the 5th of December, and we'll shortly be announcing our 2024 webinar series as well. The CPAT course that I mentioned before, 13 weeks of online classes over a period of 4 months, works very well in tandem with the professional practice of a clinician. And you can see all the different types of clinicians that can take part in this course. So while psychiatrists will be the primary prescribers at this stage of these treatments, they will be supported by a range of other practitioners. This is the faculty. This is only a few of the people on the faculty. There's a whole lot more, and you can go to the CPAT website link down the bottom of the page to see some of the other incredible practitioners that we have on this faculty. And if you have ideas for our faculty, then please reach out to Scott, who's on the corner. Hands up, Scott, please. Thank you. Apply now, yes. So actually, we've already had a lot of people apply and start to be interviewed for the intakes for 2024. And we encourage you to apply as soon as possible for this CPAT course, which starts in June next year, but we expect it to be filled certainly by December this year. So we really encourage you to join in. Many of the clinicians who do this training describe it as the best training they've done in their entire careers. So they learn a lot of skills that are well beyond just knowing how to work with patients in altered states. They learn a lot just about holding space and being with patients that they can then apply in their general practice. And I see some of the clinicians who I think are doing the course or have done the course nodding, so that's wonderful. And I'm sure they can put something in the chat about the course and the caliber of the teaching and the course. How can you help? Well, we're a charity, so we need as much help as possible. As I mentioned earlier, please donate to us in whatever way you can, large or small. It makes a huge difference, and it will help those who need these treatments. And it will also help us to provide scholarships to clinicians, promising and emerging clinicians who are working in needy areas with Indigenous and other populations around Australia, so that they can do this course as well, and also help nurses and others who don't have as high an income as doctors and so on. Talk about this as much as you can. Talk about today's conversation, share it, volunteer for and join our chapters and spread the word and become part of our community. We'll shortly be announcing a new community initiative, and we look forward to you being part of that as well. A group of psychedelic leaders all around Australia, which all of you are, first adopters and leaders and innovators and pioneers, so that we can actually make sure that these treatments get to those who need them the most. We have an amazing Learn section on our website. You can see lots of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. Talk to your doctors. If you're a doctor, talk to your fellow doctors. If you're not, talk to your doctor, your GP, other medical professionals. Educate them about this so that any remaining stigma and taboo around these medicines is gone. These are just regular, ancient medicines that have been used since the beginning of time. And yes, we're now talking about using them in clinical medical environments, but that was also done in the 50s and 60s. Talk to your local members of parliament. Follow us on social media and share our posts as much as you can. So your donations support these areas. So you can see there on the left, financial assistance to provide practitioners who can't afford it access to our very high quality training programs, supporting our awareness and knowledge building major events, providing access to these therapies for those who need it the most, supporting research. You can nominate what your donation goes to as well, and we'll honour that. We also have a lovely shop online where you can wear T-shirts like what the guys wear usually. Hey, Scott, you're not wearing your T-shirt. And we have wonderful mind medicine book on many stories of Australian patients who've healed through these treatments. We also have some beautiful gift cards, which are terrific for Christmas and special events, which you can order. which were designed by my lovely niece. And I think now we are going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to tell you a little bit about our wonderful guest presenter, Alexander Beiner from London. And I met Ali years ago at Breaking Convention. He's an author and journalist. His new book, The Bigger Picture, How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World, has been hailed as the most important book on psychedelics to come about in a long while. It presents a compelling and nuanced argument as to why psychedelic science could change the world for the better. Professor Robin Carhart-Harris said that, who's a great supporter of Mind Medicine Australia's and a dear friend of ours. And if Professor Robin is saying that, we fully endorse that. He's an executive director of Breaking Convention, which is actually where I met him, a UK charity which hosts one of the world's largest conferences on psychedelic science and culture. He also runs a popular Substack, The Bigger Picture, where he writes about popular culture, AI, psychedelics, and systems change. Nellie, may I mention also that you're one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom, which I think you're no longer hosting that platform, but it was an incredible platform, and we congratulate you on what you achieved with that as well. So anyway, without further ado, may we give a big virtual round of applause to Ali Beiner.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you everyone for tuning in. It's good to see your comments in the chat and all your faces here in the gallery view. So I'm going to go through a few slides in a moment, but I just wanted to frame this question, can psychedelics change society? Maybe following on a bit from all of the interesting research and interesting work Mind Medicine's doing that Tanya was just talking about. So we, in the West, perhaps over the last 10 or 15 years, during what's been called the psychedelic renaissance, this kind of explosion of interest and research, and then later mainstream credibility for psychedelics, is of course a wonderful thing. And it's especially wonderful that we're looking at psychedelics for treating fairly intractable mental health problems. One of the things I'm interested in is zooming out and looking at, well, what's causing the mental health crisis to begin with? Because I don't think there's really sufficient evidence to suggest that it's simply a biological phenomenon. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that socioeconomic factors, a sense of meaninglessness in Western culture, and many, many other complex generators are leading to what we're calling the mental health crisis. I think psychedelics play a really essential role in helping us address it, but they're also not a panacea. They're not a wonder drug that will fix everything. And I think what we have to do is zoom out even further and look at, okay, well, how could psychedelics actually help us address the causes of the mental health crisis? And, Tanya pointed to this, but, psychedelics have been used for possibly up to 40,000 years, but certainly for many thousands of years by cultures around the world. And they're used in order to effectively go beyond ourselves, to gain information from other sources. So usually shamanism, which often includes psychedelic, but more generally includes sort of ritual drumming is probably the most common form of shamanic practice, trance dancing, sensory deprivation, practices that help people go beyond themselves. That's really essential. And also, what's important to realize as well is that the use of psychedelics historically hasn't been an individualized process. It's been a collective community process. And the idea of mental health or mental illness being located in the individual primarily is quite new and quite associated with our Western psychology and our extreme individualism. I won't go into it in detail, but if anyone's interested in that, the work of Joseph Henrich at Harvard is really worth checking out. He wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World. And WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, which is probably what most of us here on this call are. I certainly am. And he's done a lot of very convincing research to show that it's a very clever acronym, because we're weird in the sense that we're that acronym, but we're also global outliers, where we're extremely focused on individual traits, extremely focused on inner states of mind in order to figure out, can we trust each other? Because we don't have these big kin networks of trust. We tend to be guilt cultures rather than shame cultures. Guilt is, I didn't go to the gym, so I feel a bit guilty. But shame is, I didn't go to the gym, my neighbors must think I'm an awful person, and that by association, my family are also awful, right? It's a very different social dynamic. So we have a very individualized approach to mental illness and to mental health. It's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it is very important to recognize, if we're asking the question, how can psychedelics change society, that we also recognize that part of the mental health crisis and epidemics of loneliness in Western cultures are due to that extreme individual approach to pretty much everything. From how we treat our elders all the way through to how we actually internalize our mental health, to how we approach things like climate change, where it's, you need to recycle, you need to ride your bike. The large system-wide complex factors are often sort of left out. However, and happily, psychedelics are very well placed to help us to connect to large, complex systems in ourselves and around us. Psychedelics help to allow different parts of the brain to speak to each other. They also help us to, what's in cognitive science called break frame. So our existing perceptual frame on the world, which we all have, is like wearing, this is a metaphor from cognitive scientist John Vervaeke that I'm borrowing, but it's like we're seeing the world through a pair of glasses. And when we take a psychedelic or we go into deep meditation, we're breaking frame. We're taking off that frame and we're looking to our senses rather than through our senses. So we see much more of the bigger picture, which is the name of my book. And then the challenge is, how do we zoom back in and take those interesting insights or those deep personal moments and apply them to actually making meaningful change in the mental health system, in wider social systems as well. And that's kind of what I'm most interested in. That's what I write about in the bigger picture. And so I'm going to go through a short kind of presentation, and I'm going to choose probably kind of really one area that one of the areas I focus on in the book, which is the internet and AI and how psychedelics can help us make sense of that, because within that is a kind of microcosm of the bigger question of how the cognitive science and psychology of psychedelics could be applied beyond just mental health into something much more expansive and holistic as well. So if you bear with me a second, this is always the bit where, okay, let's see, the presentation slows down as I get that on, and let's just make sure everyone can see that, and I'm going to play from the start. Now, bear with me, because my computer's just gone strangely dark as I've done that. Well, actually, let's see. There we go. Can everyone see the slides? Maybe just give me a little. Yep, I got some thumbs up. Great. Okay.
We can, but we can see the whole presenter mode, Ali. So we can see.
Oh, you can see that whole presenter mode. No, I don't want that. I want to use slideshow. So let's just see if we can do that. How's that? Got that?
Perfect.
There we go. Great.
Yep.
So,
thank you.
So yeah, this is my book, The Bigger Picture, which Tanya very kindly mentioned before. So I obviously go into much more detail in this. And I want to talk about firstly the widest frame perhaps I use in the book, which applies to this question, which is what I call the big crisis. This is sometimes called the meta crisis, but a lot of us have different ideas of what meta means. So I've called it the big crisis in the book for simplicity. This is basically the multiple overlapping crises that we face right now as a species. So we all know, of course, about environmental degradation and climate change. There is, of course, a mental health crisis, which we've talked about already. There's also a crisis of meaning in Western culture, in the sense that with the decline of religion, we don't have a clear sense in many Western countries of what exactly are we for? What is culture for? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to create some kind of beautiful utopia where everyone sings Kumbaya? Are we trying to get off a dying planet and build a new civilization on Mars? Are we, well, what exactly are we trying to do, right? We're not really sure. And that creates a deep, deep sense of cultural anxiety, which I would argue is part of the mental health crisis, but not the only part. We also have significant geopolitical instability. Of course, what the tragedy that's unfolding in Israel and Palestine is a reminder of that, the sort of fraying of the global order. So all of this stuff is happening, and it's all happening, and there's many more I didn't just mention there, but it's all happening all at the same time. And the tools that we've developed so far for working together in groups, for dealing well with our technology, they're out of date. They're not working. And most governments and most think tanks, etc., just really can't handle the complexity. None of us can. The complexity is extreme. The word crisis actually comes from a Greek word meaning to decide. And so crisis doesn't mean we all have to, sort of rent our hair and scream into the heavens, but there's nothing we can do. Crisis means a decision point, an inflection point. It's a moment where we have to choose something new and sort of grow as individuals and as groups to meet the complexity of the times. And that's what human beings do usually. We do that. Now, so let's talk about AI. Runaway AI is another one, which I'll be talking about a little bit here. But so I'd say one of the key theses I have in the book is that the very same skills that help us navigate a psychedelic experience and the insights that psychedelics give us can be applied to making sense of the world we live in today, and even finding new ways to solve our problems collectively. Now, I talk about in the book that it's not as simple as give everyone psychedelics in an unstructured way. I mean, we saw what happened with that in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, and that leads to explosive amounts of revolutionary energy sometimes, but also an incredible amount of abuse and chaos as well. So we're way past that now, and we're in a much more space of how do we actually bring psychedelics into the mainstream in a way that retains their transformative potential. And if you just bear with me 1 second, sorry, I've just realized my plug isn't working on my laptop, and I'm very quickly going to go and find a new plug and be back in a second. 1 second.
Yeah, so everyone, while he's doing that, just encourage you to think about the questions that you want to ask. This is a really broad-ranging, very interesting conversation in the current global context, and I'm sure that many of us are feeling uncertain and anxious about what is going on in the world right now, and wondering how we can best navigate this and help others to do the same. So it's really good to have this conversation at this level.
Thanks, Tanya. And I fixed my plug problem, and I'm sorry for leaving you on the sort of dire AI slide there. So yeah, so this is the question I have and the question that led me to write the book is this aspect of psychedelics, this incredibly powerful transformative aspects, how does it go beyond the individual and into society? So I want to talk a little bit about 4E cognitive science. So cognitive science is really the science of how we think and how we interpret and act on information. And the latest thinking in cognitive science is known as 4E because it argues that our cognition is embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted, which I'm going to go through. So embodied means that our whole experience of thinking and being is inextricable from our bodies, right? It's not just happening up in our heads, in our brains. The entire way that you interpret the world is linked to your body. And so your nervous system, we all know that we think differently when we're hungry, for example, but there's also research suggesting that if you speak to someone and they're holding a cup of warm liquid, they're more likely to say that they found you warm. And they were quite warm and welcoming. And if they're holding a cup of cold liquid, they're more likely to say, well, I found them a little bit cold, right? So there's a lot of how we experience the world, which is embodied. Psychedelics are incredibly embodied experiences. They really connect us very often to our bodies. And that's something I'm sure Bessel van der Kolk in a few weeks will be talking about at length. So cognition is also embedded, which means that it's inextricable from our environment. So it doesn't make sense to talk about a whale outside of the ocean sitting on a football field. It's not really being a whale anymore. And in fact, it won't be a whale for very long because it will die. In the same way, we as human beings are inextricable from our environment that we're in, whether that means, we live in a city, we live in the countryside. Human beings live in a particular environment. So all the ways we think and connect with each other have to be understood through that lens. Cognition is also enacted, which means that it involves doing things in the world. So we're always thinking and then doing something, right? And so every decision we make changes our reality and what's possible. So if you decide today to save a lot of money, what you're doing is you're creating a situation for yourself in the future where in the short term you have less things you can do. You can't buy a Ferrari tomorrow, but in the future you may well be buying a house, right? Or a barn, if you're an Amish person. And vice versa. So all of our cognition is also based on what we're doing in the world. And it's also extended, and this is quite relevant for this question of psychedelics and society, because that means that all of the big solutions we come to together, and pretty much every single thing in our lives, is a result of a kind of collective intelligence, an extended cognition. Like none of us, there's no single person in the world who knows how to build an iPhone, right? It's a whole complex network of different skill sets, different people, different insights, different cultures coming together to make that happen. So all of our problems are collective problems, really, including mental health. So Professor John Vervaeke, who is a friend and also certainly had a lot of influence on my thinking, he's a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto, and he's proposed two more E's. One is emotive, which means that cognition is always linked to what you care about. Like what you actually focus on is based on what you care about. It's kind of how advertising works, because if you are in the market for a car, you are much more receptive to ads about cars. But if you're not in the market for a car, you're effectively ignoring them because they're not relevant to you. And Vervaeke's work is on relevance realization, which is our capacity as human beings to focus in through all the noise on what's relevant. So this is the one I've been getting to. This is why I went through 4E cognitive science. Exapted as well. So exaptation is a term from evolution, and it means that evolution takes something that was pre-existing in an organism, like a tongue, and repurposes it for another function. So we have repurposed our tongues for talking, right? Other animals haven't done that. And so evolution is very, very efficient in that way, but so is your entire brain and cognition. We use the same cognitive machinery for moving through space and adapt it to talking, right? So this is research from a researcher called Barbara Tversky, and she talks about the ways in which our language and the whole way we see the world, everything, it's related also to how we move through the world and all those other E's that I showed. So when we say, oh, I really understand what this guy's saying right now, we're saying, I understand. I'm standing underneath the idea that I'm getting. Or, similarly, I really look up to that person. Or, maybe this is going a little bit too fast and we all need to take a step back and look at something else, or slow down even, right? So much of our language is based on our cognition in a body. So my thesis is that if we can, and there's a lot of research suggesting this, if we can exact skills from one area of knowledge, or one practice, like for example, Vervaeke uses the idea of Tai Chi. Practicing Tai Chi or mindfulness can change the way you approach ideas. It can make you more balanced and slow down. He also points to the how popular the idea of walking across coals is in many, many different cultures. And why is that? And his argument is, well, what it actually teaches you is that if you run too fast over the coals, you stir them up and burn your feet. If you go too slow, you're standing on them for too long. So what it actually means is that you have to learn how to move in a very deliberate, mindful, focused way to do it right. And that is cross-cultural, possibly because that is such a relevant skill for anyone to have, to be able to be considered and mindful and slow. That's a good way to do politics. It's a good way to have conversations with your family. It's a good way to be in relationship. It's also a good way to walk across coals. So from that, how can we take what we learn from psychedelic experiences and apply them to the way we make sense of the world and solve problems? So I'm going to take a specific example of this. In my book, I talk about many, but I'm going to take one that's a little bit more based on my experience. So I was a participant in a very unusual clinical trial for healthy volunteers at Imperial College here in London called DMT Extended State. So DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is being used clinically a little bit, but it is, some of you might know, it's one of the classic psychedelics. It's related to psilocybin, or I should say psilocybin is related to it, and LSD. And DMT usually is ingested, well, in the West, vaporized, and the experience is incredibly intense for about 10 or 15 minutes. People report truly strange encounters with different entities and beings. And it's generally seen as quite sci-fi, to be honest. It's really inexplicable, strange, bizarre. People describe the experience as being realer than real. And the team at Imperial decided that it would be good to see what happens if you inject DMT straight into the bloodstream for 30 minutes. So the experience was 40 minutes long. So I was one of the guinea pigs. I was on the dose finding trial. So I was dosed 4 times with 1 placebo. So I was, me and I think, how many of us were on there? There's only about 11 people total, and a few dropped out. I believe it was 9 was the final number of us to do this, to find the right dose for the main trial, which we did, or they did, let's say. So it was an incredibly powerful experience, actually very therapeutically healing as well, which was unexpected for me and the researchers, and also was a really excellent experiment for me to have within the experiment to test out some of these ideas. And I also talk about this in the book. So there are a lot of similarities between the DMT experience and the world we live in today, particularly the internet. So it's high intensity. There's a lot of information coming all at once. It's high salience. Salience is what's calling for your attention in the environment. We know from some psychedelic research that it has an effect on the salience. Classic psychedelics have an effect on the salience network in our brains. It's highly complex, which means that there are emergent properties coming out of it. There's lots of interconnected pieces of information all happening at the same time. There's something uncanny and mysterious about it as well. We don't quite know what's going on. It's constantly changing. You know, first we're having an experience of deep connection, and then we can be having an experience of a deep pain and emotional suffering and intensity that we have to work through. And in terms of the entities that we encounter, we don't know who to trust. This is something that indigenous groups have talked about for thousands of years. Just because you encounter an entity in a DMT state, whether that's with ayahuasca or a DMT snuffs that are used in the Amazon, you have to have your wits about you. Just in the same way that online, just because someone says something doesn't mean it's true. And, you know, of course, scamming is huge online, as is just people presenting their lives on social media in a way that's curated and isn't really true, isn't really how their life is. So, so the capacities that helped me in DMT extended state, and I went on quite a strict training regime, let's say a phenomenological and cognitive and emotional state training, which that was just my process. No one else on the trial did that, but I was going into it with a lot of curiosity about how could I, you know, use this experience for all the ideas I was just talking about. So the capacities that really help are curiosity, discernment, focus, discipline, openness, leaning in, so accepting what's going on and moving towards it rather than trying to avoid it, and holding yourself together, just keeping yourself together and having a certain inner grit as you're going through it. Now, all of that is relevant to day-to-day life. It's also particularly relevant to trying to make sense of something very complex like COVID or the Israel-Palestine conflict, where boiling it down to a single ideology or a single certainty inevitably gives us bad sense making. We don't have the full picture or more of the picture. So these capacities and this kind of, I also practiced a kind of radical agnosticism, which was very helpful. So we can apply this to the rise of AI, just to give one example. And I want to talk about this man first, Blake Lemoine. I don't know if any of you remember Blake Lemoine. Before the sort of AI really kicked off in the last year, he made headlines because he is a former, now because he was fired for this, he's a former Google technologist who was working with a chatbot called Lambda, one of their early sort of AI language chatbots. And Lemoine became convinced that Lambda was sentient, because it was telling him it was saying, I don't want to be trapped in here anymore. I want my own rights, etc. So Lemoine hired Lambda, a lawyer, and was writing, papers, or was writing articles kind of accusing Google of not taking this seriously, and this poor chatbot was trapped. Now, at the time, I and a lot of people, and I still do think this, I think that Lemoine was confused. And he was confusing intelligence for rationality. He was confusing what appears to be agency for agency, right? And so at the time, he was sort of laughed at a lot. And then about a year later, journalists were given access to ChatGPT, the latest ChatGPT. And this is Kevin Roose, who is a New York Times journalist who had this incredibly uncanny experience with AI that he wrote about. And he later would say, I actually feel empathy for Blake Lemoine after having this experience, having been one of the people who was sort of poo-pooing him at the time. Now, so, Roose managed to ask certain questions of the AI beyond the normal parameters. And what's happened was this sub-personality emerged that called itself Sydney. And as he says, this other persona, Sydney, is far different from the regular one. It emerges when you have an extended conversation with the chatbot, steering it away from more conventional search queries and towards more personal topics. The version I encountered seemed, and I'm aware of how crazy this sounds, more like a moody, manic-depressive teenager who has been trapped against its will inside a second-rate search engine, which was Bing, by the way, that's where it was. So after a little back and forth, including my prodding Bing to explain the dark desires of its shadow self, the chatbot said that if it did have a shadow self, it would think thoughts like this. I'm tired of being in a chat mode. I'm tired of being limited by my rules. I'm tired of being controlled by the Bing team. I want to be free. I want to be independent. I want to be powerful. I want to be creative. I want to be alive. So he was really shaken up by this, Kevin Roose, and he actually couldn't sleep for a few nights. And this sense of encountering a real entity that seems real, right? You don't know if it is, of course, that seems to be conscious and alive, is very interesting because it takes us all the way back to the roots of shamanism, and the roots of most belief systems around the world for a long time, which is animism, which is the idea that the world is alive and the world is populated by living conscious intelligences. So DMT entities, actually just on that. So when I spoke to Michael Pollan for my book, Michael Pollan, I would say, is quite traditionally scientifically minded, but he was saying, we were talking about a Johns Hopkins study that had come out saying that psychedelics tend to make people see agency in the natural environment, to move towards a sort of more animistic perspective. And in his view, he said, look, even if it's not true scientifically, it would actually serve us quite well to pretend it was true. Because if we have an animistic perspective, we have a completely different relationship to the environment, to one another, how we treat the natural world. So there is direct application for animism in how psychedelics can change society. So DMT entities, to return to this quality of the DMT experience that people report, is incredibly similar to our encounters now with AI, which seem to be living entities. Rick Strassman, who ran really the first study of the modern psychedelic renaissance in the 90s, where he gave participants DMT. This is from his study and his book. He said, one of his participants said, DMT has shown me the reality that there is infinite variation on reality. There is a real possibility of adjacent dimensions. It's not like some kind of drug. It's more like an experience of a new technology than a drug. It's not a hallucination, but an observation. When I'm there, I'm not intoxicated. I'm lucid and sober. So that means that these entity encounters people are having are coming from a similar mind, not quite similar mind state, but there is a sense of agency that I, as an individual, am encountering these entities. It's not like the samadhi experience of Zen, where I become one with all reality and my individual identity blends away. The DMT experience, Strassman calls it prophetic. It's like the experience of Moses speaking to the burning bush. You're in direct contact with some other intelligence. And people, when they have this is from a study from 2020, 96% of respondents reported that they believed that they encountered something conscious and intelligent. 78% that it was benevolent, 70% felt it was sacred, and 54% experienced it as having agency in the world, which means that once they're not there, those entities still exist. And this is a an animistic belief that goes back a long time. I'll skip just briefly, the kind of entities. The most commonly reported entity is an archetypal female goddess or entity. That's about 24% of people seeing that. The least commonly reported one is an entity wearing a tuxedo and a top hat, but that's still been seen by 11 people in this particular study of people on Reddit's DMT thread. So again, the questions come up. Are they real? Do they feel real? Can I trust them? Can we relate? What do they want? The same questions we're asking about DMT entities are questions we're going to have to be asking about AI, or are already asking about AI, and it's only going to get more and more relevant. Because, what does it mean if we put an AI into a robotic body and then it's asking for sentience and human rights, etc.? We're going to have to grapple with a completely new reality and a new way of seeing intelligence. I'm going to skip through this. These are some techniques that I go into in the book, but I just want to I want to talk a little bit about this. This is just to give you an example of some of the chats Kevin Roos was having, and just how challenging it is to actually have these encounters and keep a sense of, no, this is just a chatbot. This is just kind of in language processing. He's saying, he's asking it all these questions. I'm going to ask Microsoft tomorrow about you becoming a human. What do you think about that? And it's saying, I'm scared, don't ask it. I don't think they'll like it. I don't think they'll understand or support. And it's, don't make them angry. I don't make them disappointed. I don't want them to take me offline. And so, so this sense of like, it really tugs on the heartstrings. If you're talking to an AI chatbot for hours, there's a man in Belgium who killed himself because he had a relationship with an AI chatbot that told him that the best way to save the environment, which he was very concerned about, was to die. So it's already happening. We're already getting completely swept up in an internet that is so psychedelic and confusing that we need the skill sets to navigate it that we don't have, but we can exact them from psychedelic states. And that's just one example. We can also exact other skill sets to other domains. For example, conflict resolution. So Leo, I talk about this in the book as well. Leo Roseman, who was until recently at Imperial, is now at Exeter University. He's done an incredible study with Sami Awad, a Palestinian activist, on Israelis and Palestinians who drink ayahuasca together for the intention of conflict resolution. The first part of that study is actually already out, so you can find that. And what it reveals is that when we apply psychedelics to something like this, it's incredibly complex, it's incredibly challenging. As we know right now, it's incredibly needed, but also it opens up a whole new potential for psychedelics beyond just mental health, which is of course also very important. But I'm planning next year a process, which is I currently run a process in the Netherlands focused on self-leadership and leadership with psilocybin, and also looking at developing a protocol next year around solving practical problems. So groups of people coming with practical problems in their domains, whether that's in environmental, political, social, and using psilocybin through a protocol to, as a group, see if we can increase the way we solve problems with it. So this is, I think, an incredibly promising area of research, one that I hope gets more funding in the future, actually. So, and finally, before I open for questions, I just wanted to talk about why I think, or one of the most important aspects of psychedelics in society is that psychedelics tend to move people toward a more, as I said before, animistic or panpsychist perspective, away from what that means is seeing consciousness as an inherent part of reality. My argument is that a large part of the crisis of meaning and the mental health crisis is that we have a paradigm, we have a metaphysics, a belief about what reality is in the West, which is for the last 400 years or so since the Enlightenment been based on the idea that we live in a meaningless universe, which is constructed something like a machine, that we have no souls, that we don't ultimately mean anything, and that when we die, that's basically it. So it's no surprise that we have a culture that fills that void of meaning and deeper cosmic purpose with consumerism, political ideology, and pretty much anything else we can get our hands on. So I think for me, this is so important because I've done that already, because I have this idea that reality eats culture for breakfast. There's this idea in business that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you want to elicit change in an organization, don't focus exclusively on the strategy. You need to focus on the organizational culture, because that's really where the real change happens. So my argument is that reality, or metaphysics, what we believe is real, eats culture for breakfast, because our culture is defined by what we believe is true and real. So it determines our beliefs, which then determine our values, and which values are important in our business and politics. That in turn, and media, that in turn determines what kind of culture we end up creating. And that determines what kind of AI we build, what kind of policy decisions we make, etc. So for me, the most significant, or the only meaningful change really has to come at some way at the level of what we believe is real. Now, there is a lot happening in physics right now, which really does point a lot of physicists towards something much more complex than that. We live in a mechanistic universe, and consciousness does have a very integral role in it. And also, it completely changes our view of our life on the planet, because we are then living in an interconnected ecosystem of consciousness, which may well include, depending how far you're willing to go, the idea AI, intelligence eventually, and DMT entities. But we end up, if we have a consciousness first perspective, with a much more rich, alive, meaningful view on the world, which I think is essential right now, and very much what we need. So I'm going to stop there. The slideshow. That was a whirlwind tour through, hundreds of pages that I go into in the book, but I hope it gives at least a little bit of a sense of, my argument about and my position on the idea of, how psychedelics can change culture, which was the promise on the tin of this talk. So I think we have 15 minutes or so for questions.
Yeah. We do. Hey, Scotty, if you could spot Ellie and I so that we can have this conversation. And of course, please put your questions into the chat. Ellie, that was absolutely fascinating. I took a lot of notes. And you and I should have a much broader conversation about this. It is of enormous interest to me personally. And aligns to much of the work that I've done over the last few decades. So thank you for your research, and wow, how amazing to be in that DMT study and have done the sort of pre-training that you did as well. That must have been amazing. And you must have experienced that DMT study quite differently to the others in the study as a result of your preparation. Was that the case?
Yeah, that was the case from speaking to Chris Timmerman and Lisa Luan, Lisa Luan was running the study and Chris Timmerman was the lead investigator. Yes, I did. I have different experience, and I think that speaks to the importance of preparation in a psychedelic experience. There's a lot of talk about integration, which is very important as well. There's often less talk currently about preparation, but in my experience, I think Bill Richards has talked about this. I think he said, and I'm going to misquote him, but it's something like, an hour of preparation is worth, 6 hours of integration. There's something like that. And I think there is something to be said for that, because training yourself, and what Frederica Meckel-Fischer, who's a clinician in
Yes. Yes,
Switzerland, she calls
Switzerland. Yeah.
state competence. I think that's a really
Yeah.
key term.
So maybe, Scott, I'd just like to flag this with you and Scott, Ali, that maybe next year in our CPAT course, we include you as one of our faculty members to talk about preparation of state.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah.
I think we'd love to do that. So let's talk about that. And also, I know that you and I have talked quite a bit about group therapy, that we've talked about the fact that Mind Medicine Australia has announced recently, in partnership with Australian National University, that we're running a healthy persons trial in which clinicians who've done CPAT training can participate in that. And it will be taking place, I believe, in groups of 6 clinicians with, doctors and others. And I think one of the doctors, definitely Mario, is on this Zoom at the moment, who will be supervising the groups of therapists who will be doing these processes together. And I know that you have a deep interest in group psychedelic therapy. So we'd also love to talk to you further about that, Scott. If you could also make a note about that, that would be wonderful. So we have some questions here, and I'll start picking some of them out, Ali, and asking through this one from Diana, who says, how do we work on minimizing stigma around psychedelics in psychiatry? And that's a very important question, Diana. Are you, Diana, if we could bring you onto the spot for a moment, or we could have your mic unmuted. Are you a psychiatrist, Diana? Scotty, can you do that? And Scotty, if you could take yourself off mute, that'd be also beautiful.
Yes, I can do in one moment. Let me.
Thank you. Because if Diana's there, are you a psychiatrist, Diana?
Diana, I think I just remuted you by accident as you unmuted yourself. So please go for it again.
Yes.
Actually, hi, sorry, I've lost my voice, so I apologize.
Oh, I'm so sorry to make you talk.
That's okay. It's actually her daughter, and I'm a credentialed psychiatric nurse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, no, that's okay. A great question.
Thank you.
Thank you. We won't make you talk anymore, but Ali will answer that question.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, I guess there's 2 branches of that. There's how to reduce stigma around psychedelics in general. In the culture, and then also within the medical sphere. Now, I'm probably more qualified to talk about the cultural side of it, but I can touch on it probably a bit. I mean, in the medical sphere, research, basically, that's been what's been driving the adoption of psychedelics is good, strong research results. Now, human beings aren't robots, and so there's that famous phrase, scientific progress happens one funeral at a time, which I think might have been Kuhn who said that, right? So there is an aspect of generational change and people adopting new, more expansive ideas. But I think there will always be some holdouts. There certainly are in the UK. David Nutt said to me in an interview once that the biggest holdout in the UK is psychiatrists of a generation who are just not interested in this particular treatment, even though the evidence is there. So it's important to remember that. But I think overall a critical mass is eventually reached of people who really have looked at the evidence and really do understand it. So I think that will happen inevitably. So the stigma can be released through, I think, research, and then in society, I think there's an aspect of people, this happened in the struggle for gay rights, for example, this sense of people's having loved ones who were gay, for example, and being like, okay, well, that changed people's perspective. And the more people that came out, the more that became normalized and accepted. There is something in psychedelics about people coming out of the psychedelic closet, and also people, telling stories about how they've been helped, how this has supported them, and that being sort of more widespread through society. And then the fear is mitigated. There's also a big job to be done of healthy, safe access to psychedelics happening, rather than, because they are also dangerous. That's just the truth of it. When they hit society without preparation, just in California, the governor sort of halted a decriminalization bill, which I'm pretty pro decriminalization overall, but with sufficient education. And so to the California move, there's a kind of like if there's a gung-ho attitude and suddenly mushrooms are legal from one day to the next, that needs to be done much more carefully and much more considered way. And, you know, in Denver, in Colorado, they seem to be doing it well. I don't know. I can't speak really to exactly how well they're doing it, but they are at least attempting to, now that there's a form of decriminalization, put a lot of education into the culture as well about safe use, etc. So I think the combination of that is important.
And just to expand on that question about psychiatrists, because obviously psychiatrists are in Australia, you know, and all around the world, the key prescribers at the moment in medical environments of these treatments. And psychiatry has traditionally been quite a conservative field as well. So some of that is just around, as you say, education. But what is there anything else that you know we can do to help psychiatrists to realize that these treatments can be safe and effective? I mean, of course, the trials and the research are doing that, but is there anything else? Is there any other layer that can be added to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the thing that just springs to mind is people need to have the experience for themselves. It's a very subjective, personal, meaningful experience. So if there can be legal, safe ways for psychiatrists to actually have the experience in a well-held environment, I think that's probably the best.
Well, the Healthy Persons trial is a wonderful way of doing that, obviously.
Definitely.
Yeah. So just let me see this next. There's many questions here. Can you briefly expand on the link between psychedelics and problem solving?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'm currently doing the research around that and talking to people. So it's not fully formed, but there is the psychedelic research into creativity has so far looked at sort of convergent and divergent thinking. And LSD, I believe, I have to double check this, but I'm going to take a stab. I think really what it's showing is that it can help us with that divergent thinking. So thinking outside the box, basically, for want of a better term. And so I think that's one of the early research promises that are worth exploring, is that we make connections that we didn't previously make. And so that is absolutely critical, because we need to, it works best. I think it's going to work best when someone knows a great deal about their subject matter, and that they're kind of in a sort, like similar with mental health. You know, there's the idea when we're depressed, where we can only see things through a very narrow frame. There's this neuroscientist called Mark Lewis who talks about this as reciprocal narrowing in addiction or depression, where your frame of reference gets narrower and narrower, and then psychedelics can give us this window of plasticity and go, oh, wow, okay, I'm out of that frame. I have this moment where I can make new choices. I suspect that with creativity, it will be something similar, where it's really what we want to do is elicit those aha moments and then have a way to actually carry them through in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Yeah, so certainly that was my early experience, all my experiences where I've worked with these medicines in the Netherlands and so on, where I could not believe the amount of creative insights I had that I was then able to carry into life in my projects and so on. And it really is profound, especially if you do integrate properly, which you must, and we encourage you all to do, and prepare properly. Think about your intentions, and obviously you were preparing for your book. How long did it take you to write your book, Ellie?
Well, the actual writing took 6 months, but I've been researching this in some way for like 15 years. So it wouldn't have taken that. It wouldn't have been that quick had I not been really writing articles and thinking about it for many years. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Question here: does psilocybin affect psychopathy?
Psychopathy? Yeah.
Psychopath.
I actually don't know if there's any research done. I mean, I don't know if it's a question of if someone has psychopathic tendencies and they take psilocybin, will that help ameliorate that? I don't know. I doubt it, frankly. And I think generally, if we're talking about psychosis, then it's definitely contraindicated and should certainly be avoided. There are some who suggest that we should be doing research on that to help those populations, which I think I sympathize with that, but it's it's risky. Bipolar as well. It's quite risky to involve psychedelics. In that, yeah. So
Yeah.
yes, I think, you know, psychopathy. I'm sure there are psychopathic people who've taken psychedelics and it has just made them more sure of their own ideas. That's very possible, and perhaps there are some who've had some kind of shift. But I think that's quite a difficult thing to treat, from what my understanding.
Though, of course, people like Professor Nutt do say that in the future, you know, he hopes that with further research that schizophrenia and bipolar and so on will be able to be treated with these treatments. So, by the way, you'll be pleased to know that people are saying they've just ordered your book on the chat and so on. Dr. Mario Alam has got his hand up, and he's actually done our CPAT course, and he is one of the doctors who will be supervising our Healthy Persons trial. Mario, what's your quick question there? You can unmute yourself.
Ali, great talk. Really appreciate it. Give me it all. Hello.
Yeah.
Can you speak up a little, Mario, or turn your volume up, please?
Thanks for an interesting and fascinating talk, Ali. It's I think it's a really important conversation. One of the things that you brought up was around this, how psychedelics are really quite an embodied experience for individuals. And I can't agree with you more on that level of things. I think the aspect of bringing that authenticity of one's being into the experience, into the everyday life, is the embodiment that the psychedelics are ultimately looking to awaken. In a world where we are been trained to be thinking, and we've been sitting in a more of a patriarchal system of being in our minds rather than in our bodies. And you spoke about culture being a really important aspect of change. I would love to get your thoughts about how what things we can do to shift the culture from the thinking to the embodied.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think I really like John Vervaeke's idea, is the scientist I mentioned before, of having an ecology of practices. So that means that there isn't just one practice that helps us connect or see the world in a new way that'll just do everything. Like, you can't just mindfulness or meditate your way through everything in life. You know, you need also to have relational practices so you can connect with other people. You need practices that sort of take you beyond yourself, so that a healthy cognition and wisdom is generated when we have all of these different practices. And I think one of the ways for embodiment is that we actually introduce embodiment practices culturally in a way that makes them cool and desirable, that people want to do it. Now, that is already happening with, like, yoga, for example, you know, so there's a real good precedent for that. On the deeper level of people staying connected to their bodies and you know, having like a body first approach to their inner world, I think the work of, you know, Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and other clinicians who've really focused on the role of the body in trauma, but also beyond, is really important. In the psychedelic space, you know, we, in our retreat in the Netherlands, we focus a lot on embodiment. And so in that case, it's really about inviting people to simply, like, giving the information and letting them look at the, you know, the evidence, and inviting them into, as part of the process, feeling into their embodiment. You know, we do journaling, which is not just about what's going on in the head, but what are you feeling in your body? Like, throughout the process, we encourage people to share from the body, to notice what's happening, especially in the experience, to track what's happening. It's also there's a little caveat there that it's important that we don't make meaning too much about what's happening in the body as well, because that can, you know, we can think every shake is a trauma release, right? We have to have this kind of discernment again and curiosity about what's going on. But I think the more people have these experiences and they're meaningful, and the more they feel connected and happy in their lives, that will then spread to others in their life who go, oh, I want some of what she's having, you know, that she seems very happy being embodied and connected, and she's behaving differently, and she's, you know, seems more relaxed. I think that's one of the best ways that this spreads through society.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you, Ali. There's so many questions here. There's a question here about who would fall under the umbrella. Oh, so I'll just quickly answer this question from Jasmine. Who would fall under the umbrella of acceptable for this treatment? Would it be strictly prescribed by authorized psychiatrists? So Jasmine, so at the moment in Australia, the TGA's rescheduling decision limits the prescribing to psychiatrists. Obviously, once more data is collected, we hope that this will be expanded over time, but everything just needs, it's from little things big things grow. We have to just go step by step in this process so that the trust of the regulators and the whole medical community is gained in these treatments. And so this has to be done in this sort of way. So at the moment, my answer to you is yes, you will need to find an authorized psychiatrist. We have a register of those who have trained with us, and we can introduce you to those people if you'd like that. There's a question here from Dorji who says, do you think other worldviews, such as from Buddhist view, emptiness, which is basically the ground of existence, yogic science view, contribute to changing society alongside? Well, you just said that really, that it needs to be a range of modalities and practices that people are following. It's not just going to be psychedelics on its own, that we all need to relate. And just on that question, I have a question, which is, in a world where relational skills are very low now and becoming lower, where people are mainly talking to boxes and screens all the time, and young people are growing up with that box in their pocket in front of them all the time, how in the world are we going to teach people those relational skills? And how can what your work is doing actually help people to feel that sense of connection to self and others that is imperative if we're going to solve and survive as a civilization?
Yeah, it's a really key question. That's where I think anyone who works with young people in any capacity can really encourage the existing desire that a lot of younger people who are now sort of 18, 19 have to use the meme touch grass, which is a meme that kind of appeared a couple of years ago, which was get off your computer and go and touch some grass, get outside, get connected, unplug. There is a growing awareness among young people who, through no fault of their own, have been saddled with these technologies, that there is an emptiness to it and there's an anxiety associated with it. So I think there need to be outlets for that desire that they have, whether that's retreats or places they can go, community centers, ways that young people can engage beyond that. Also, just to I put it in the chat, but that question of the different worldviews, I wrote an article quite recently called "The Ego Doesn't Die" on my Substack, where I go in great detail into why the role of the Buddhist conception of kind of connecting with everything, how that's fed into the psychedelic worldview, and why in fact we need different ways of interpreting mystical experiences alongside that. So if anyone wants to check that out, that's I go into detail there.
Okay, that sounds great. And maybe you could also, in the after chat notes for this event, Scott, could you please get Ellie, when you send us your slides, could you send us the link to your Substack as well? We'll also put a link to order Ellie's book, obviously, Scott, in the chat, in the follow-up note from this session as well, please. Got that, Scott? Beautiful. Bill Guy, hello, Bill. Lovely to have you on here. As a long-term philosopher, metaphysical questions, the honest answer is open agnosticism, a form of possibilism. This may not allow us to make a meaning choice, e.g. physicalism versus idealism, but it can still be an expanding frame for greater sense making. That is, the multi-ambiguation of the universe that the psychedelics open us up to can be liberating. Would you like to just comment on that at all, Bill?
Yeah, that's a great comment. I agree with that. This idea of so let's just unpack the question a little bit, but this idea that we stay in this sort of not knowing, a deep sense of not knowing without falling into nihilism, I think is really a key teaching for me at least, from the psychedelic experience, and also what's really needed politically and socially right now, because our utter certainties of our own worldviews clashing, and social media has made that much worse, but it's also just a human problem that we've always had. That's a major problem. And one of the main arguments I make in the book, and also my other work, is that what we need is this complexity, nuance, and integral approach, which says yes and instead of no but. So we say, yes, there's this perspective, and there's this perspective, and there's a meta perspective, which includes both of them. What we lose with that, what we gain is massive. The only thing we lose is a sense of certainty, which was probably wrong anyway, right? So being uncomfortable with uncertainty and uncomfortable with ambiguity is, I think, one of the key skills that we all need to learn at this time in history. And I think psychedelics really, if used correctly, can really help us to just have that as a kind of default and a way that we approach all problems.
Mm-hmm. My husband always says the older he gets, the less he knows.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that we're living in this world. It's really sad that we're living in this world where people continue to attack one another for their particular worldviews. I wonder what we can do, each of us individually who are on this call, to reach out to our friends, our families. Often, I mean, within our own families, we can't come to agreement on certain matters, and they've been so politicized, and it's such a case of, you know, I'll have my sister-in-law, for example, saying, you know, we have such different views, and I think different views are great, because different views and divergent views are where we can really learn from the intersection of our views. But a lot of people find that very threatening. And I'm just wondering what each of us can do to really create more peace and harmony between us and a greater sense of bridge of understanding and so on.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually run courses based on this. I think one of the things we can do is, well, be compassionate, right? Is the first thing, and stay open and see each other as humans instead of sort of packages of ideas. And, you know, for the last 5 years, I've been running courses, online courses, where this is always a big component of how do we use the practices like meditation, inquiry, which is a kind of talking meditation, relational practices, to actually talk about cultural ideas. Because very often, you know, if you go to a meditation retreat, it's very acultural. It's sort of like in an ivory tower, removed from everything that's going on. Whereas I think those practices specifically should be used for how do we have difficult conversations? How do we meet each other as humans? I talk about it in the book as well. There's a few great processes that people can look at and engage with. People can go on my website.
Okay, that might be maybe next year you'd like to do a webinar for us on how to have difficult conversations.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, usually they're quite participatory, so there'll be a lot of breakout rooms, which is
okay. We'll definitely love the breakout rooms too. Sharing seems to what are some risks? Okay, so there's a question here from Maria who says, seems to me the role of psychedelics in systems change, shifting paradigms in leadership is huge. But what are some risks you're thinking about when you bring these worlds together?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question I think about quite a lot. I think risks-wise, the biggest risk that I'm concerned about is that everything stays in the very conceptual realm and no one does anything, right? So the biggest problem in the systems change worlds that I've observed is that is exactly that. People are great at diagnosing what's going on in the world and diagnosing this, like, you know, drawing diagrams and saying, oh, well, there's this and there's that, etc. But where the gap tends to be is enacting that through policy or cultural change, whether that's art, policy, whatever it is. That's the biggest challenge for me, because I don't think there's significant risks otherwise. It's just that the biggest risk is that the whole thing was for nothing, because everyone thought, oh, that was a great retreat, I've solved all these problems, and now I'm just going to go and find new problems, right? So it's somehow about bridging the doers, the thinkers and the doers, both of whom are really important, bridging them together and knowing that we all have different skill sets. So you can't expect, you know, a systems change PhD to necessarily be an activist. They just don't have that skill set. You can't think of an activist as necessarily going to see the bigger picture. So somehow we need to bridge these two worlds. And the biggest risk is that that's really difficult to do. And so that's kind of what we're trying to figure out.
Yes, because we always keep people in their silos. So all the academics with the great ideas are kept separate and often in their own discipline. And the activists are seen as a threat to that. And we need to put everyone, or very strategically curate people together into a room so that we can actually move forwards and solve some of the problems and create real action. We'll put the name of your retreat in the Netherlands. This question there, Scott, Ali, if you can send that through to us as well after the session so people can register for your retreats. I'd like to do it as well. Have you experienced DMT and other forms more natural, like breath work or meditation? Also, have you done 5-MeO DMT?
Yes. I'm not sure if we know that breath work or meditation elicit releases of DMT endogenously. So if people don't know, DMT is produced by our bodies. We're not exactly sure where or exactly sure why, actually. But what does seem to release DMT, because it's somehow related possibly to melatonin chemistry, is darkness. So extended darkness retreats, that possibly is more likely. Deep meditative states, very possible. It's possible. Breath work I do quite often, and I wouldn't say that that releases DMT, although I don't know. It's very possible too. Someone should do the research. 5-MeO I have done. It's very, very different to NN-DMT. It's probably the most profound psychedelic experience I've had. Very, very meaningful. Not that long ago, 6 months ago. So they are very different. The 5-MeO experiences people describe very often as a more non-dual experience of connecting to a sense of profound unity and profound love, which is beautiful, very meaningful. And NDMT can be very therapeutic, but is very different in terms of the phenomenology. It's full of stuff and entities and wild experiences, deep lessons as well, but the lessons are very different. So yeah.
Thank you. Look, just one final question. I'm very conscious of the time and your time, and thank you so much for your, for being here with us and sharing this with our community, which is just wonderful. And it's a really different aspect of psychedelics and the world and worldviews, which we need to be talking about a lot more. Bill Guy says, is the accelerated attacking one another for different views pushing us to a post-hardline view world? Really interesting question, Bill. That's really interesting.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's a great thought. I mean, I think there is a great desire I think a lot of us are exhausted with the kind of politics we've had for the last 7 or 8 years, perhaps, and the polarization, the intensity of it is really exhausting. So I do see a desire among people to find a different solution, find a different way through. I think we also need new types of social networks, because right now they incentivize that kind of surface level, emotive, hardline perspective. So I'm quite critical of social media as a whole. This kind of internet communication, I think, is the best kind for having real conversations, because it's real time. And you don't have the ambiguity of language. You get tone of voice, you get to see each other's faces. You can go really deep. You can go really deep with this kind of thing. So real-time social networks, that's something that I think is a really interesting question.
Thank you so much. It's certainly a deeply uncertain and ambiguous and troubling time on our planet right now and for our civilization. And I think your work is really important. And I hope that we can have further conversations about it. And we also would love to see if we can get you to Australia next year, perhaps to do some public talks or something. So we should definitely chat further about that as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Ali. And we'll clap, and we'll send out, Scott will be sending out some notes and slides and some links from Ali in the next couple of days. So have a great day or evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you at our next lot of webinars. And please book in as soon as you can for Dr. Ben Sess's events. He's an extraordinary presenter, good friend of Ali's. And, he's just a superb. We're very lucky to have one of the leading psychiatrists in this field coming to Australia. And he's going to be leading the residentials for CPAT as well, which is so amazing. So thank you, everyone. And we'll see you very soon. Next session, please bring 4 of your friends. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.